There was nothing else at all in the whole world but football.
Hi guys, this is the Triple F with another episode of Under the Floodlights. This episode will be focusing on one of the most iconic and prolific England players of all time, Jimmy Greaves. I'm joined by lifelong Tottenham Hotspur fan Les Wildman to talk about the Spurs and England legend. We look at Greavesy's greatest achievements, his biggest regrets, and the closest comparisons to other modern contemporary footballers. Please join us now as Jimmy Greaves goes under the floodlights. Yeah, we're obviously going to be talking about Jimmy Greaves. Is he the greatest ever Spurs player in your opinion?
Well, it's not really as simple as that, is it? Because I've not seen everybody that has played for Spurs, obviously. Bill Nicholson always said that Ron Burgess, who was the captain of their 51 championship side, was the greatest ever Spurs player, or he'd be first on his team sheet. And he also, and obviously managed Greaves and Dave Mackay. Greaves always says Dave Mackay was the greatest Spurs player of all time. But the uniqueness of Jimmy Greaves, in my opinion, is a simple thing, that he was the bloke who could put the ball in the net more often than anybody else who's played the game in this country. And I think that's enough, isn't it, really? You know, I don't think you can compare players of today to players of yesterday. Though I'll probably go into as we talk. You see what I mean? It's a different game. So I think all you can really do is talk about how good someone was at that time, and he was no doubt the player in terms of putting the ball in the net. Roy Keane was saying the other week on the Euros, the key thing is putting the ball in the net. And I think if Roy's prepared to diminish his own part in any team by saying that, perhaps we should listen to him. You know? So,
yeah, I'd agree with that. What type of player do you think he was then? If you talk about that he had this ability to sort of put the ball in the back of the net, what made him so good at being able to do that? Do you think?
Well, I think actually it's a combination of things that you rarely see. I mean, I think just to sort of place this in context, and I think you're probably going to come back to this question later on, but if you look at someone like Aguero, pre the Aguero of the last few years, where mainly his role was putting the ball in the net, that was Greaves' role. People used to say, well, he doesn't do a lot else in the game, but if you're putting the ball in, if you're putting the ball in the net more often than anybody else is putting the ball in the net, I think you've got to ask what else you want. I mean, there were games where he would run around like a headless chicken, particularly against Chelsea, but that didn't seem to work as well. His genius, if you want to tell it, and I think it's an overused word, but his genius in football terms was just being there at that moment and scoring the goal. And if you look, everybody can go on YouTube, look at the 1963 Cup Winners' Cup final against Atletico Madrid. You'll see he scores 2 goals there from about 10 yards, and he just taps them in. People say, oh, he used to just tap ins. Yeah, it is a tap in, but the ball's travelled 40 yards and he's got on the end of it, and a pitch that leaves a lot to be desired, and just taps it in on the volley. You know, I suppose what player was he? He made everything look simple, but clearly it isn't. And as we see time and time again, people will pay a fortune for a goal scorer. If he was playing now, he would, in my opinion, be the most expensive player in this country.
Yeah.
You know, he relied on a whole set of really, exceptional skills. He had pace, he was a good dribbler, he had this amazing anticipation. He just knew that uncanny thing of He knew where the goal was. But also what you have to take into account the context of the game then and now. And I say you can't compare players probably because of the difference in conditions and everything else. But when he got the ball, he always had to move quickly because somebody would be kicking him. You know, the tackling that he would be subjected to these days would be a straight red card. At the very least, it would be a yellow card, and that would be what he would be subjected to throughout the game. Makes a lot of difference, you know, in terms of how you have to play the game.
Yeah.
You know, so you have to be clever. You know, you'd be forever injured if you didn't have that sort of sixth sense of how to get the ball and move quickly with it. So, you know, I mean, I'm in danger, I know, sometimes when I talk about Greaves, and I'm sure there are older Spurs fans who would agree on this. There is a danger of pretending, or almost giving the impression that you think he never missed. Of course he did. You can go on YouTube, you can think, God, look at that miss. But he missed less than anybody else, if you see what I mean. So you have to, you know, I'm not suggesting that we're talking about a guy that never ever missed, but all the great strikers, like, I mean, Ian Rush said that Greaves was the greatest goal scorer of all time. And I think if Ian Rush said that, it would be, in my opinion, pretty much the main challenger to him as a goal scorer. I don't think you can go much better than that, can you, in terms of sort of a positive rap, really.
Do you think to be one of the greatest goal scorers of all time, that sort of composure and level-headedness was one of those top attributes as well? Because I was seeing a documentary and they said that he was perhaps one of the most cool-headed players of all time, just because he never really let the occasion get to him.
Yeah, I think that's a key element. I mean, the Greaves documentary, which has been shown in the last few years, is a classic example of the special qualities. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that every single level that he played at, his first game he scored. I actually saw his debut for Chelsea. It was at Spurs in 1957. I think he was 17 then. And of course, he scored. Unfortunately, it was for Chelsea against Spurs, but, you know, I can at least say I saw his first ever goal in the league. But I think he scored at every level, like all the schoolboy international, youth level on his debut. And I remember, I mean, just to place this in the context, the 62 Cup final, one of the big buzzes before the game was, will he score in his first Cup final? Well, of course, he kept us waiting 4 minutes before he scored, you know, and that shows that on the big occasion, he could do it. You know, I don't think you can argue with a guy who scores, you know, at every level. I think sadly, and this is why I decided to talk about him today, the thing about the 66 World Cup, people almost talk as though that sort of in some way diminishes him. I don't think you can say it does. He wasn't dropped, he was injured and he couldn't get back in the team. Now, Ramsey was obviously proved right because he won the trophy. So you can't criticise him for that. But it doesn't mean to say that in some way it diminishes Greaves, because I think we'd have won the World Cup if Greaves had played. So, you know, but then again, I'm biased. Yeah.
I mean, I was going to get to that question, but I suppose we can just talk about it now. But I mean, had he been fit for those knockout stages of 66, you still think that England would have won anyway?
Absolutely. I think if you, and this places him, and this is a positive about other players as well. Roger Hunt was an absolutely outstanding player for Liverpool. Absolutely outstanding. I think if you were to talk to Liverpool fans of my age, they'd say, you know, he was one of the greatest ever. I mean, I saw him play for Liverpool on a number of occasions against Spurs. He was an absolute top player. Geoff Hurst was a top player. and obviously has the ultimate accolade. He scored, the hat trick in the final. But, Hunt was a terrific player, but he wasn't as good as Greaves. Not a lot of difference, but he wasn't quite as good as Greaves, in my opinion. Now, obviously, I'm sure there would be Scousers screaming at the screen if they were watching, saying you're talking rubbish. But I'm really saying, there's something really positive about Hunt. But if Greaves had played rather than Hunt, or if Greaves had played rather than Hurst, I still think we would have won it. I think he hadn't scored for 3 games. That was unusual. I mean, it's when you look at his record is extraordinary. I mean, if you want to place it into a context of how good he was, I looked this up. I'm not such a nerd that I know this off the top of my head, so I had to look it up. I did kind of know it. I think he played for Chelsea for 4 seasons, and he scored 124 goals in 157 appearances in the first division. Now, if you look it up, and I did, in those 4 years, Chelsea never finished higher than halfway. And in one of the seasons, they ended up, I think, 4th or 5th from bottom. And yet he's scoring 128 goals. That's an extraordinary. His final season there, just without getting too much of a no, 40 games, 41 goals. It's a goal a game in a side that ended up halfway up the table. So he obviously carried them. And I think his final game before he went off to Milan, if I remember rightly, he was carried shoulder high by fans from the field. So that shows what a massive part he was of that team. So that to me is probably the bit that I kind of feel has got lost over the years. People keep talking about Harry Kane catching his record up. I'm not in any way knocking Harry. Love Harry. Please don't go, Harry. But you can't get away from the fact he may overtake him. People forget about the 128 goals he scored for Chelsea. It's that. I think for fans of my age, and you hear Gary Lineker making this point a lot, sometimes you get the impression that Sky invented football in 1990. And prior to that, there was no game. And it starts with Alan Shearer. When you look at, again, I know I'm being a nerd, Shearer, 283 goals in the top flight, 559 appearances. Greaves, 366 goals in 528 appearances. So in less games, he scored roughly 80 more. It's a tremendous record when you think how good Alan Shearer is. It's not in any way diminishing players like Shearer. It's just placing Greaves into a context. Now, I know people will say, yeah, but Shearer added more than Greaves did to the team. And you could make the same argument about Kane. Of course you could. But the tough bit, he was the best at, so here we are.
If you're interested in coming on the show for an Under the Floodlights special to talk about your favourite player or manager, please email the triplef2021@gmail.com or DM the triplef84 on Twitter. All contact details will be in the episode description. Hope you're all keeping safe, and thanks again for listening to the Triple F. I know you said before it's difficult to make these comparisons, and I kind of agree in a way, because obviously different eras were completely different to the football that we have now, especially back in the 60s and whatnot. It was just a completely different class of football. It was just different. It's not to say that one was worse or one was better. It's just almost impossible to put them side to side. But as this is a football podcast, we will attempt to do it anyway. But I mean, the closest comparison to players playing right now, or ones that have played within the last 20 years or so, who would you sort of come up with?
Well, you're looking at Aguero, Salah, those kind of players. on top form who are good at putting the ball in the net. Obviously, Harry Kane, though Harry's developed his game differently in the last couple of years, but it's that kind of player, the person who you expect to score so many goals a season. And if you think about, you know, top players in world football, the word great is overused. It's all right if you sort of qualify in some way. So you can talk about, for instance, I don't know, Gary Mabbott, a Spurs great maybe, but I don't think Gary, who's a top bloke, would want to suggest that he's an all-time great. An all-time great is Messi, Ronaldo, Pele, or etc., etc. It's all right to qualify, you know, by club or by country or era or whatever. I think the thing is, nobody could argue Jimmy Greaves is an all-time great. And you probably make that, I'm sure Man City fans will make that argument about Aguero, etc. They're the kind of, but that's the level we're at, you know, that real top level. I don't think you would, these pomp, I mean, to place this into context, I think if a peak form, peak era Messi and a peak era Jimmy Greaves were available, some teams would probably, amazingly enough, in this country, I'm sure not in Spain or something like that, would think, which of the two would we want? And I think I'm not trying to in any way diminish players like that or get too carried away. But if your team desperately needed a bloke just to score the goals, you might think your money would be better spent on one than the other. Now, I'm putting that up at a really very high level, but I don't think I'm delusional in doing that. You know, I think most people would think that's a reasonable sort of comparison. You know, players at that level, you know, they're great. I think if you were to ask me, say, you know, in the history of English football, who's the best English player of all time at international level, I think Bobby Moore, clearly. Bobby Charlton is probably, you know, sadly, I think has dementia, but he's probably the greatest living English footballer all round, but certainly the greatest goal scorer in our game, and he's still alive, but in a bad way, I understand, is Greaves. I'm trying to think of, I mean, I hate to say this as a Spurs fan, but I rate Aubameyang. I think he's a very good player. He's not a similar, you know, he's primarily a goal scorer. He relies more on sheer pace, I would say. So he's not they're not comparative in that sense. But of course, again, it's the bottom line is they finish. They put the ball in the net, and I suppose he's another one that you would have to include in that sort of group of goal scorers.
Someone like Lewandowski, perhaps? I mean, is a player that doesn't...
Yeah.
Someone that more or less, you know, he puts the ball away. I think that's his top sort of attribute, and that's the thing that, you know, catches most people's eyes. But that he has a bit more to him than just that as well. And I get that sense from Greavesy that he's not just a fox in the box. He's not, you know, he can sort of link the ball, and he does, you know, he's got a bit of pace about him as well. Lewandowski, I think you can kind of say the similar things about him.
Yeah. He's, I mean, the other guy that comes to mind, I mean, Lewandowski is again a more sort of old style centre forward type player, a little bit more, whatever that means, old style. But I mean, Suarez, you know, for that short period at comparatively short period at Liverpool, was another guy of a similar ilk, probably without the more negative aspects of Suarez, you know. But
yeah.
you know, but You
It
know,
wouldn't leave chunks in people's shoulders then.
No, I don't think. Even though sadly he had his own problems, Jimmy, I don't think on the field anyone ever thought anything negative about him. You know, he was a very genial sort of guy. You know, he certainly wasn't. He certainly didn't bite anyone or anything of that nature. He might have been bitten a few times himself, I suspect. Here we are. Yeah, Lewandowski, all those guys, you see, I think that's the thing. Those real top players, it's very, it's always hard to understand why they are better than other players of a similar ilk. And I think it is that natural ability to finish, isn't it? You know, that makes them, you know, I mean, you look at Ronaldo, Messi, all these guys, you think, what is it about them that makes them so special? It's just something. I don't think you can really. I don't think you can coach that. You can make players better, but it's got to come from within the player themselves. And we are talking at the real elite level here, I think.
So, I mean, was it usual for British players to go abroad back then and sort of test themselves?
Well, goodness, you're giving me a chance to eulogise all round here. I think a guy called Tony Marchi, who also played for Spurs, but was of Italian extraction, he was a very good player. He went to Italy, but I don't think he was a massive success. And I think there have been a couple of others. But of course, the reason, well, there was a number of reasons why Greece went at that time, because the maximum wage was still in force at that time. And of course, what happened, ironically, as soon as Greaves went, they abolished it, which is why he was keen to come back, because he didn't like Italy very much, or didn't like the regime under which they played. But the big star player had been there, was a guy called John Charles. Now, John Charles, sorry, I think I may have said Charles, but John Charles. Now, Charles was a magnificent player. I was lucky enough to see him. First game I ever went to at Spurs, he was playing for Leeds. And to show how good a player he was, he's largely forgotten. When they talk about great British players, I'm sure Leeds fans and some Welsh fans will, you know, certainly agree with what I'm saying. But he's a forgotten player, really. But
sure, Juventus fans will as well.
Well, yeah, Juventus fans as well. Yeah, I was talking about in this country because I think he's more highly rated in Italy than he, you know, historically than he was here. But when you think about a player who the only argument was not about whether he was Britain's best player at the time, but whether he was the better at centre back than he was centre half, as they would call it, centre back, or at centre forward. Now, what an amazing thing that was the discussion. What was his best position? Because everyone agreed he was the best centre half in this country. He was also the best centre forward in this country. So he went off to Italy, to Juve. I think they played entirely as a centre forward. It was a massive success. And I think maybe that might have been also encouragement for someone like Greaves. Greaves probably looked at it and thought, this guy's a great player. I'm a great player. Perhaps I'll be a massive success. He didn't like the discipline. That's quite clear. You know, I think they didn't like his drinking and smoking either, which I think is particularly weird these days when you see a player that good and he's having a fag. Just seems really strange, but that's the way it was, you know.
Yeah, it was a given thing back then, wasn't it? Just smoking and beer, and you know, up until the 80s, even it was, you know, nobody sort of batted an eyelid at it.
No, it's an interesting little sideline, really. The drinking car. I mean, as an Arsenal fan, the Arsenal drinking tales are legendary and actually really amusing. You know, just so some of that stuff is just it's so amusing. It's almost like it can't be true, but it is. You know.
Went over the line sometimes, shall we say? But
yeah, it's a different culture to the one that Wenger imported with him, you know. And of course, everybody has followed since then.
Yeah. They say Wenger ruined that culture then, should we say?
Well, yeah. I don't know whether he ruined it. He certainly changed it, didn't he? You know, yeah.
Like on Facebook, follow on Twitter, subscribe to YouTube, do all that shit,
So yeah, it was a shame that he sort of struggled at AC Milan because, you know, like you say, great players and AC Milan being a historic great club. Yeah, it seems on paper that it would have been a great sort of match. But like you say, if he just wasn't a fan of that discipline and wasn't a fan of that sort of strict regime, then yeah, it probably really only going to go one way.
He was totally unsuitable for that kind of regime. Clearly, you know, he was clearly a man that was used to drinking and smoking. I mean, he's failed in Italy. I think actually he played 12 games and scored 9 goals. So it wasn't a complete failure. In, you know, I think if any player in the Premiership at the moment was to score 75% of games, we'd be pretty happy, really. You know, but it wasn't for him, and it was fairly obvious. And I think Spurs. I don't think the rules allowed players to be tapped up by they didn't have agents in the same way. But I think Bill Nicholson had already had some conversations with Greaves previously, and of course he was the absolute cherry on the Spurs cake at that time. You know, they'd won the double. You know, I mean, if you again to sort of show how good Greaves was, Les Allen playing the double side was a very, very good player. These days would have probably played for England a number of times, but of course in those days internationals were more rare, and Allen was really unfortunate that he got pushed out because Greaves was an upgrade, but it doesn't mean to say that the guy he replaced wasn't a very, very good player. But that's how good he was, you know. So, no. The Italian thing is quite interesting, isn't it, around that time, you know, because when you look at it, some very good players have gone from this country, like Ian Rush. I think Rush famously said something about the trouble with Italy is this is a foreign country. I might be misquoting that slightly, but it's this kind of spirit of, you know, the Welshman abroad, really, I suppose. Yeah.
It's a strange thing, actually. You think about British players that played abroad, because I think, you know, obviously Greaves and John Charles were a great example of it back in the day. But then there was a period from the 80s and the 90s where we saw it all the time. But then from the late 90s, 2000s, and only really up until recently with the likes of Sancho and whatnot playing abroad, it was weird how you had that almost 10, 15-year period where British players just didn't go abroad. I wonder why that was, but it's, you know, maybe you just need that John Charles, you need that Jadon Sancho just to sort of set the example, set the sort of the touch paper to say, look, we can do it. So perhaps that's how it's done.
I think it's partly to do with the fact that British players that have gone have been very good players. You know, you have Trevor Francis, Kevin Keegan, those guys.
Chris Waddle.
Top players. Chris Waddle, yeah. Hodden went to Marseille. I think the only one that I could... I think Souness did all right in Italy.
Sampdoria, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think Keegan was probably the biggest success in lots of ways.
Yeah.
But, you know, and players like Tony Woodcock, where we are talking the real top players who have gone, but they've not probably ripped up, you know, tore things up in the same way as we might have expected, given their level of talent, you know. So perhaps that's why players still haven't been prepared to go. I think what now you see is because of this massive squad thing that we have here, where teams are carrying almost like two teams, that I think some of the younger talent thinks I'd be better going to Germany or something like that, establishing myself and then coming back, as Sancho is probably about to do, or appears, almost certain to do. So
Yeah,
it's a different thing, isn't it? It's moved on. It's really only the younger players that are doing that. We're still not seeing that many British players going abroad, are we? Not a massive amount anyway. So you'll have to see.
that's why for me, Kieran Trippier deserved a lot of applause from me personally. The decision to go to Atletico Madrid, and he's done fantastic as well. I think he was a big component to them winning La Liga last season. So yeah, I think the fact that he's done it well and he succeeded at it shows that it's something that I hope from now on a lot of English players will look at that and see that as a good example.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you are almost dragging me into a rant about Trippier. If you had to ask me what was Pochettino's worst decision, it was to let Trippier go. I mean, I understand they let Walker go because they had both, and I think Walker was 50 million, wasn't he? But also Spurs fans have to put their hands up, I think. The season after the World Cup, he clearly was playing hurt. You could see every game he was hobbling, and I think he subsequently said he played when he shouldn't have played. But the crowd were on his back because, obviously they'd seen him in the World Cup and suddenly their expectations had risen. In my opinion, he was a better player than Walker because his use of the ball was better. I know obviously he doesn't have that terrifying pace that Walker's got, which Walker now seems to use better defensively than he did when he was at Spurs. But I just can't believe that Spurs thought it was a good idea to get rid of Trippier and get in Uriah instead. I mean, it's to me, if ever I have any doubts about Pochettino, they're all encapsulated in that one transfer. So
just going back to Greavesy, because I see here that obviously after he left Spurs, he went to West Ham and he had a season there and a fairly decent season. But after West Ham, was it a massive sort of injury that he suffered and put him out for a few years?
No, it was his drink. It was drink dependency, alcohol. He was, alcohol dependent. He was.
What age was that?
Well, it would been. If you're talking, he's born 1940, so I think it was by the late 60s. He clearly was drinking. We didn't know that, of course, but he was clearly, drinking a lot. I mean, I remember an interview with him, and I think this says something about, we're talking about the culture again that changed. He said that the Spurs team, which is, in my opinion, a great team, full of world-class players, like at least 4 or 5 world-class players and very good players. Their whole culture was about drinking. They all went drinking together. That was the culture. He pointed out that Danny Blanchard was the captain. Now, Danny Blanchard, I think, is the thinking man's footballer of all time. He was a very intellectual kind of guy who went on to be a journalist, and he sort of really deep thinker about the game. According to Greaves, he was like the one of the leaders in the drinking. As Greaves said, even Danny was up for a good drink. And I think that's what they did. So obviously, inevitably, I think in that culture there are going to be a few casualties, and clearly. Jimmy was one of them. Now, I know a lot of people put that down to the disappointment of the '66 World Cup and You know, I think that's dare I say, a bit of psychobabble, really. You know, we don't know that was the reason that he fell into sort of heavy drinking, but very sad. And obviously that affected his later career to a degree, you know, because he obviously loved the game, because he came back out of retirement and played non-league football. So about 4 years later. So if he was prepared to sort of play at that level, I mean, I know he was playing for Barnet and who were the other teams about? Chelmsford City and Woodford Town. I mean, if you're
Brentwood as well was one of them.
great, yeah. I mean, if you were prepared to play at that level, you must really still have liked the game. So it's a bit of a tragedy in that sense. But I think you have to be sort of balanced. It's no, you know, as I say, I get very annoyed that when people are, you know, they focus on the '66 World Cup, they focus on his drinking, because he had a very successful TV career after that, as I'm sure you know. St and Greavesy really was the forerunner of most of the football chat shows that we watch now.
Yeah.
So it's you know, so I just think we have no way of knowing what you know causes someone to get into that situation, but he came through it, and you know, fair play to him, because a lot of people don't. So well done, I think, is the you know, in lots of ways. And you know, I don't know, when we look back over his career, that's probably one of the reasons that, you know, what some of my comments earlier, I think we shouldn't be focusing on what he didn't do. What we should focus on is the fact that he's the highest goal scorer at top level in English football by some way. And what more can you really, you know, say about someone? It's enough, isn't it?
If you like football films, then come check out the Triple F Cinema, where I'm joined by guests, sometimes football fans, sometimes not, to review a specific football film.
Give me 2 tickets to that football film right now.
Do you think it's a shame that he never received a knighthood?
Well, shame. It depends on whether you like the honours system. I mean, I'm not really a great fan, but because I think, you know, sometimes people who, well, hopefully we might see a change. There's a lot of people working in the NHS and God knows what else who probably deserve knighthoods, and I hope they get them. But I think it's an outrage that Greaves didn't get one. You know, I mean, you look at cricket, you know, some very good cricketers have got knighthoods. I'm not knocking those guys, but their contribution to the game isn't any greater than Greaves' contribution. I think if you look at it, I think he and Ron Flowers were the last two of the '66 squad to get an honour. And I think, as Greaves' son said, it's a bit too late really for him to, you know, they're delighted, but, you know, the guy's in a wheelchair, he's 81. I think it's sad that that's the best we could do for him. I mean, had he disintegrated into a, you know, a sort of lifestyle of, you know, drinking and, you know, et cetera, if that's had been his long-term fate, I might say it was down to sort of moralising by certain people, but I think when you look at the fact that he turned his life around and a very successful career in TV and his football record, I think it's a bit of an outrage that he didn't get a knighthood. But, you know, you could say the same about Bobby Moore as well. And I think, you know, football's been badly treated in the honours system, you know. I'm sure Owen Morgan will get a knighthood. As a Middlesex supporter, I actually think that kind of says everything. That a cricketer will get a knighthood, but football players don't, you know. So,
But I think you alluded to his health status at the moment. It's not the greatest, is it? I think.
no, it's not. No, and I think it's a great shame. Just on the honours thing, that at two levels. I think within the game, when we listen to the coverage on Sky, I think really only Gary Lineker really keeps poking away at this. The rest of them just carry on. I think when you look at his status in the game, which I don't think is as great as it should be, but also the absence until recent of any kind of formal recognition. I think that's very sad, and I'm sure must hurt him a little bit. I mean, you'd have to be a very special individual when you're watching, the matches on TV, and I'm assuming he probably does watch them, and you hear people always talking about, Shearer, the highest goal scorer in the Premier League history. There must be a lot of young fans who assume that Shearer's the all-time greatest goal scorer or scored the most. So I'm sure you might forgive Jim if he's there shouting at the TV, "What about me?" Perhaps he doesn't do that, but if I was him, I would be. Just a final point, actually, if I could.
Yeah, sure.
You've only these players from this era. There's only a few left. Like, I think there's about 5 of the Spurs double team that are still alive or in that squad. Obviously Greaves came the year after. There's a few of these players left, and I think it's across the board. It's a shame that maybe their contribution to British football is forgotten. I'm sure there are, a number of players who were outstanding players in the 60s. I'm not just talking about Spurs players, but an example, I'll pick out a Spurs favourite of mine, Cliff Jones, arguably the bravest player that's ever played the game. I would say that I'm a Spurs fan, but I could eulogise for ages about Jones and his, the kind of tackling he received and everything else. And I think it's a shame that somehow Sky in particular have managed to create this whole idea that somehow that football wasn't the same as the football. Yes, it's different, but it was still in the 60s, before I think the hooliganism thing hurt football for a period. Unfortunately, it's still around, but it's been, as we saw at Wembley the other week, but all Caesar Stadium have helped that. But in the 60s, football was the working man's game, wasn't it? People could go, most people could afford to go to football there. It's not a cheap hobby now. I say as an old age pensioner, but that doesn't mean a lot, But I think it's a great shame that some of those players who are now very old don't really get the recognition that they deserve, But then again, I'm an old bloke myself, so what do you expect? All right, Simon. Thanks a lot.
Yes, thanks, mate. Okay. Yeah, take care now.
Yeah, and you. Stay safe. Stay safe. Cheers, mate. Bye.
Mate, bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the Triple F. If you could please drop a like on our Facebook page, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and follow us on Twitter, that would be massively appreciated. Hope you're all keeping safe, and thanks again for listening to the Triple F.